We're at Salle in Norfolk, and this is one of the county's great churches. And you might be asking yourself, why is it so big? To understand that, we need to go back to the middle of the 14th century, when a frightening pestilence swept across Europe and reached Norfolk in 1349. Perhaps half the population of the county died. But one of the effects of this pestilence, which we learned in later centuries to call the Black Death, was that the old pattern of land ownership was broken up. Much of England had been divided up by the Normans and shared out amongst their friends. But after the Black Death, land became a commodity to be bought and sold, and new families rose to prominence and new wealth. It became very important for them to capture the imaginations of the people of their parish, and also to make sure that their souls were prayed for after they died, because after the Black Death, then last things had become very important. One of the ways they could do this was to pay for a rebuilding of the parish church. And by an accident of history, there was more than one family in this parish with the wealth to do that. And so, over the course of the second half of the 15th century, the parish church at Salle was rebuilt on a grand scale. And here we are inside what is one of the great statement churches of the late Middle Ages. And again, you might be asking yourself, can there ever have been enough people to fill this space? But we need to remember that these churches weren't built for congregational worship. They were built to the glory of God and to the glory of the people who paid for them, but also at a time when churches were still used for private devotions and liturgical processions. So the wide aisles on each side of this nave were big enough so that people could move through them. When I look around, it's not possible to see all the tiny details that the late medieval craftsmen put into this place, but again, it was done for the glory of God. This is the font at Salle, and it was installed here as part of the late medieval rebuilding. It's what's known as a 7 sacraments font, and 7 of the 8 sides depict the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church. These are baptism and confirmation, ordination and matrimony, confession and last rites, and most important of all, Eucharist, the Mass. All that's left of the rood screen at Salle is this lower section, which is called the dado. But how big it is! The whole screen must have been enormous. It was painted with saints. There's 2 of the apostles on this side, 2 more on the other side, and on the gates there's the 4 Latin doctors. You might think, to look at the other panels, that this was never finished, but if you look closely, you can still see the scratch lines where the faces of the saints were, and the faces were scratched out by the Anglican reformers in the middle of the 16th century. We're in the chancel now, and these are the return stalls, and this is where the priests, who were paid for by the families to pray for their souls, and the cantors who sang, this is where they would sit, and underneath it's hollow, and there are what's called sound holes, and this is to make the singing much more resonant and fill this huge space. The liturgies of the late Middle Ages were lengthy, and if you were one of the cantors or priests sitting in these seats, you'd have been grateful because the seats lift up, and they're called misericord seats, which is the Latin word for mercy, which meant that when you had to stand, you could lean back. There was a new urgency in the church in the years after the Black Death, and the change in emphasis that this brought about would result in a new architecture, perpendicular. These big buildings are filled with light from the enormous windows, And these windows would have been home to coloured glass, images of saints, angels, and the sacraments. In the 16th and 17th centuries, much of it was destroyed. So when you come to Salle today, as splendid as it is, you can't help mourning for what has been lost.